In the early 19th century, the idea of a Great North Woods had shifted in our country's imagination from the exhausted pine forests of New England to a vast, largely unsettled region north and west of the Ohio River. Newly acquired from the British following the American War of Independence, the Northwest Territory became a legal territory of the United States on July 13, 1787. The territory covered more than 260,000 square miles, which was a landmass equal to 1/3 of all the lands acquired from France in the Louisiana Purchase. The Northwest Territory, which lies east of the Mississippi River, and the Louisiana Territory, which lies west, share a common trait. Historian James Loewen asserts, in the case of the Louisiana Purchase, that the United States purchased only France's claim to the territory, as the land belonged to the tribes who inhabited the area. The same was true of tribal claims to lands in the Northwest Territory. The respective treaties transferring Louisiana and Northwest Territory to the United States did not speak to inherent claims to territory by Indian peoples who had lived on the land and from the land for centuries. And Indian peoples had not agreed that the territory in question was France's to sell or Britain's to relinquish to the United States. In Loewen's view, the United States actually acquired the lands slowly throughout the 19th century by purchases from individual Native American tribes and by wars against others. In the 19th century, ancestral Indian lands, prairies, forests, lakes, and rivers were rapidly transformed through a string of treaties in quick succession, irrevocably transferring almost all Indian lands into Euro-American ownership. This in the guise of an imminent need to tame the American frontier in order for an energetic nation to capitalize on the enormous resources and wealth in the West and Northwest. The Northwest Territory was immense. It covered all of the modern states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, as well as the northeastern part of Minnesota. From a perspective of potential for material wealth, westward expansion quickly centered on the upper Mississippi and St. Croix River region, a storied latticework of rivers and lakes, abundant wildlife, and vast tracts of white pine as far as the eye could see. The white pine resources along the St. Croix River and its tributaries represented an untapped economic windfall of unimagined proportions, waiting for treaty lands to open up and for commercial logging expertise to arrive. It is understandable that no one in the early 19th century could have anticipated a gold rush in California at mid-century. Yet in retrospect, surprisingly few today can believe that so great was the economic value of harvesting the white pine in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and upper Michigan that it produced more millionaires than did the California gold rush. The economic practices of the fur trade eventually exhausted the supply of fur-bearing animals in the region, but the physical landscape and natural habitats, although altered in over 200 years of harvesting, might have been restored. When it came to cutting down the pine forests of the St. Croix River region during the second half of the 19th century, however, few people perceived that this celebrated landscape and its natural resources could not be sustained at such a rapid rate of extraction. Not the pine, not the beaver pelts, not the Ojibwa and Dakota hunting and fishing lands, and not even a vast wilderness if pitted against the allure and potential for wealth from an onrushing wave of European settlement that laid claim and then laid waste to this edge of the American frontier. In the case of the white pine, in little more than one person's lifespan, pine resources that once seemed inexhaustible had disappeared. The story of the St. Croix Scenic Byway region and its people and communities begins with a surging rush of migration spearheaded by East Coast New Englanders who soon set their sights on settling the St. Croix Valley and founding Minnesota. From 1800 on, it would take a while for settlement to reach the upper Mississippi and St. Croix valleys, but it was not for want of trying. Within a few years after the turn of the century, it might have seemed that all of New England was heading west. As many as 500 ox cart caravans left Albany daily, headed west. In 1 year, 40,000 persons passed through Utica, heading west. Dozens of cities bloomed along the route, Americans were on the move despite the slow means of travel at their disposal. In 1807, Robert Fulton's steamboat Clermont revolutionized traffic, first on the Hudson River and then on all water routes available to carry migrants and immigrants west to St. Louis and north on the Mississippi into the heart of the St. Croix Valley. Fort Snelling was the northernmost military post on the Mississippi River and had been garrisoned since 1819. The fort, located on high bluffs at the junction of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, was the transportation gateway for arriving migrants and immigrants on their way to St. Paul, Minneapolis, and the St. Croix Valley. Under the 1805 treaty conducted by Zebulon Pike, the Fort Snelling Military Reservation acquired land on both sides of the Mississippi River, upstream from the fort to St. Anthony Falls. The town of St. Anthony was founded on the east side of the falls, and Minneapolis was founded on the west side. In 1872, the two cities merged as the city of Minneapolis. Fort Snelling played a critical role in supporting European settlement in the Minnesota Territory and developing commercial sites and cities that were instrumental in founding Minnesota. A young Army officer, Lawrence Tolliver, was appointed Indian agent at Fort Snelling in 1820. His instructions as Indian agent were no less a challenge than to change century-old Native American lifestyles and the fundamental character of the Indian peoples within his assigned region. As head of what was known at the time as St. Peter's Indian Agency, Tolliver set upon his role with vigor, first engaging the tribes and their leaders. Tolliver was expected to encourage the Dakota to give up hunting as a primary method of subsistence, educate their children according to European American standards, give up their traditional religion to become practicing Christians, and adopt European American agricultural methods. Tolliver was also supposed to encourage a change in traditional Indian gender roles. Traditionally, Dakota women and children had worked the fields and gardens, and the agents wanted men to give up hunting and take over this work. To the extent that tribal members refused or simply didn't adopt European agricultural practices, it contributed to a misconstrued view in some white communities that Indians would not work. It went without saying that another of the traditional male Indian roles of protecting tribal members and going to war if necessary to protect traditional harvesting areas should be abandoned in favor of a stable peace between tribes. That was not to be. In spring of 1835, Tolliver moved his entire household to St. Peter's Agency at Fort Snelling after President Andrew Jackson reappointed Tolliver to another term as Indian agent, a post he had already occupied for more than a decade. Author Leah Vandervelde recounts Tolliver's trip west with his family. After leaving the Tolliver home in Bedford, Pennsylvania, the trip west took 6 weeks in all, requiring a stagecoach ride and at least 3 steamboat transfers to traverse half the continent that at the time constituted all of the American nation, 1,600 miles along the river corridors from western Pennsylvania to St. Peter's Agency. In St. Louis, the party changed boats and took passage north toward Fort Snelling on the Warrior, the largest steamboat ever to have plied the waters of the upper Mississippi.
In 1836, when Michigan became a state, there was a huge set of treaty-making activity going on in the lower part of Michigan. And so there was in the air this assumption that Indians are going to get moved west. Sometimes you hear west of the Mississippi, sometimes you hear west of the Missouri River. And many bands from southern Michigan got moved to essentially the central part of the United States. And so Potawatomi, some Ojibwa, and Ottawa, and other bands were pulled out of Michigan. And then the assumption is that the Wisconsin bands are going to move as well. So everybody knows these people are going to go somewhere. They're going to make essentially the same as the Indian Territory that the Southeast tribes were moved into, what you know as Oklahoma. That's going to happen also somewhere in the north. We just don't know where it is. And the irony is it never happens. That movement of the northern tribes is the background assumption behind all of the treaties through 1863 in Ojibwa country. We know these guys are moving eventually. They're not going to be staying here. It's bizarre stuff because decisions are made based on something that never happens, and the Indians are the victim on the whole thing. Okay, so then the next thing is that in the Ojibwa country, there's a treaty in 37. That's the important one that was for the Mille Lacs Band and for the spearfishing rights in Wisconsin, all of that. And then in 42, there's a treaty the first one is often called the Pine Tree Treaty. The second one in 42 is the Lake Superior bands, and that one deals primarily with minerals. I want you to think about where are the waterfalls, because that's what the 37 treaty is about, the pine trees and the waterfalls. In 1834, the Indian Agency was given new guidelines by Congress. Before that, there had been different rules. And before 1834, it was legal for private parties to negotiate for access to Indian resources and pay the Indians. This was happening in Wisconsin at Chippewa Falls and at Black River. And there was a move afoot in the early 1830s to do the same thing with St. Anthony Falls and St. Croix Falls. However, the rules made that impossible. You no longer can do that. Ironically, a set of traders, Henry Sibley, William Aiken, and Lyman Warren from La Pointe, two Ojibwa traders and Dakota trader, made a private treaty with the St. Croix Ojibwa. I found it in the Sibley papers. It is an amazing document, and they bought the rights to log along a portion of the St. Croix and the Snake River for an annual fee for 10 years. And the payment was in mostly the same kind of goods that the Indians were buying with furs. So it was powder, and it was, ice chisels and whatever it was that the Indians tended to buy. That's what was offered. And it was illegal. You couldn't do that. And in fact, the earlier deals that had been done by Hercules Dousman and others on the Wisconsin side of the river, those were null and void now. They couldn't do them anymore. Although somehow those mills seem to keep grinding, according to what I'm reading. Somehow someone gets in there and seems to make a few more planks once in a while. The only way that those trees can be accessed by white people is for them to be purchased as a commodity in an Indian treaty event. The Indians cannot vend any other way. And the 37 treaty, the irony of it is that they didn't sell dirt. They were selling trees. And in fact, they were specifically selling pine trees. And they did a visual. They laid on the table, we are selling this, and they lay a conifer branch down, not this, and they laid an oak branch down. They did not want their maples to go. They didn't want their birches to go. They had uses for those. These very tall climax forest pine trees were actually creating a sterile environment for trapping and small animals and things. And so if you've had a burn in an area and you've got young trees, you can see that there's a different biome going on there for at least a while. And so they knew that if they lost some of those pine forests, they weren't going to be that far behind. So it was a win-win for both sides, but of course it was illegal.
Historian Ken Martins, who's on the board of the Afton, Minnesota Historical Society, points out an additional strategy employed by the Ojibwa as they negotiated the 1837 Pine Treaty. It was well known that pine trees were already being harvested in the St. Croix Valley on both Ojibwa and Dakota-controlled lands. Fort Snelling Indian agent Lawrence Tolliver, when he heard about it, attempted to put a stop to all cutting until the treaty was in place. At the time, however, much of the treaty land was in dispute between the Ojibwa and Dakota, with no easy remedy except war to settle the disputed land claims. But one aspect of an Ojibwa strategy to expand their territory was agreeing to a treaty allowing lumbermen to cut pine trees, even in lands held by the Dakota. It didn't cost the Ojibwa anything to agree to sell pine trees on Dakota land, and it just might be a way to pressure the Dakota to move out of the region. The Pine Tree Treaty of 1837 turned out to be a mixed bag for both tribes.
So then we come to the treaty, and they're selling that. What they always believed was that they were selling trees, as they had a year before with Aiken and Sibley and Warren. And instead, what they found was that they were selling their village sites, they were selling their hunting, their annual round visiting places wherever they went. And they were paid for 20 years only. At the end of it, there is no balloon payment. There is no anything else. It just ends. Slowly, Wisconsin and Minnesota cede the Ojibwa country. And in 1850, the Wisconsin Ojibwa are supposed to move. As long as we're talking 1850, I want you to know that one of the missionaries that is involved with the Protestant Ojibwa missions, a man named Boutwell, who ended up living in Stillwater in the late 1840s, was working on the removal. He had been hired to be involved with the removal. And if you know who William Warren is, he was the son of the old American fur factor, the regional boss at La Pointe or Madeline Island. And William Warren is known as the best Ojibwa scholar of the 19th century. He is the one that verbally interviewed chiefs and other people to hear their history, and then he created a series of newspaper articles that were eventually published on the history of the Ojibwa. And William Warren was the best interpreter. He spoke Ojibwa better than any Ojibwa, according to what I was reading. And Warren and Boutwell had a feud through the newspapers, each one accusing the other one of bad faith dealing with the removal. It's very strange. But I can read letters by Watrous that will tell you that just about all but 300 of the Wisconsin Ojibwa are now living in Fond du Lac or Sandy Lake or in that vicinity. And then I can read a letter from Warren that says, we brought a few over, and they said, so is everyone else coming, and do you have food for us, and is this all set up? And they said, well, and these guys said, no, I'm not staying here. I'm going home, and I'm going to pass the word. So there were actually very few people who had ever come on the removal. The removal was a joke, and it wasn't a funny joke. It was a very sad thing because incredible amounts of money were expended in it. And the lies are the foundation, then, of the relationship that Watrous and Ramsey have. Whether Watrous was lying to Ramsey or they both knew that this was a boondoggle, I can't tell you. And Watrous had been a trader at Madeline Island, and he had the political clout to be named the man that was going to move the agency from Madeline Island over to the Minnesota area, because there weren't going to be any more Ojibwa over in Wisconsin, and so you had to move that agency site over. And then Henry Rice figures into this also. There is this letter that Henry Rice, who had been a Winnebago trader, and he came up into Ojibwa country and took on the old Lake Superior traders. Henry Rice had suggested to Ramsey that if the Ojibwa payments were to occur in Minnesota, This is the trickle-down theory of economics, that money would then benefit that territory which had so little economic base at that time. And it was just, your Indian money is being frittered in Wisconsin, is essentially what he said. Get the Indians over here, get the payment here, and then you'll get the money here. But he said that in, I think, 48 or 49. And I know that Rice recommended that. How many times he recommended that, I can't tell you. But it doesn't take any genius to figure this one out, that Minnesota Territory was fueled, especially with the Winnebago payments, and then the Dakota payments as well. Henry Sibley, who became our territorial delegate when Minnesota Territory was started in 49, literally gave a speech in Washington that said, do you know you guys never read these things? And you should. How can you make decisions on Indian affairs if you don't even read the report that you got last year? So the removal is simply something that everybody knows is going to happen. But Sibley sees that there is no more land for the removal. That's part of the sad thing. He sees this one coming, and he's very nervous about it.
Treaty negotiations leading to the Ojibwa land cession of 1837 opened at the St. Peter's Agency on July 20th, 1837, and lasted 10 days. Governor Dodge, territorial governor of Wisconsin Territory, was in charge of negotiations for the United States and considered the purchase of the timber country an absolute necessity to avoid an Indian war. Dodge moved the treaty process forward so quickly that affected Ojibwa bands that actually lived in the lands under discussion had not even arrived until 5 days of negotiations had already been completed. Dodge sought in vain to bind the assembled Indians to cession before representatives of these bands from the Wisconsin interior arrived. The assembled Indians were mostly from Minnesota, and only a small fraction of their land was involved in the proposed cession. Those from the Lake Superior shoreline had no land involved, but they insisted on waiting until the affected bands arrived. In his annual report after conclusion of the 1837 treaty negotiations, Dodge predicted that the treaty would attach the Ojibwa to the United States in peace, and if the proper steps were taken, the Indians could, and he said, easily be controlled by their agents.
I just reread the script that is the negotiation script, and then I reread the letter that Governor Dodge wrote afterwards to his superiors in Washington. He had been the negotiator, but he was the territorial governor of Wisconsin Territory. And he says, this was just a little place. This wasn't a big place. This is a small place. Holy smokes, it's central Minnesota and central Wisconsin. It comes from the Mississippi and it goes all the way over, where? To the Chippewa River. Come on, that's a big tract of land. And what it was subsisting people with as a resource, now you have to share that with any white guy that shows up. That was amazing. That was a huge thing. An amazing thing to me is that so many people from the upper Mississippi showed up who didn't have a dog in this fight. They weren't going to lose anything by signing this treaty. But they're there. And so you have Hole in the Day. This is Hole in the Day Sr., Buganagashik, who is there. You have Flatmouth, who is the old warrior chief from Leech Lake, who is there. And of course, their men are with them, and in many cases, their families. Everybody is going to do this tourist thing and go down to Fort Snelling and see the show. We have over 1,000 Ojibwa there. And some of the ones who have the biggest stake in this have the fewest representatives there. Very interesting. So how do these warriors from distant villages figure into all this? And what I believe is that when the Dakota got pushed out, it required some pretty gutsy warriors to do it. And they basically broke out the village pattern such that some of them would be all the way on the perimeter and in other places that needed always to be defended. Because the Dakota were not going to give this up. They were always going to try to fight back to get that wonderful biome. And so what we have then, Hole in the Day is one of those warriors. Flatmouth is one of those warriors. They essentially are giving permission. Yes, this land that we fought so that the St. Croix people could be there, we now are going to say, it's okay, you can sell it. With the end of that treaty, the assumption is that we're going to get paid. But the problem from that is that they don't understand the civics lesson that we have to put all ninth graders through about how a bill becomes a law. In this case, how does a treaty become a real thing? And Congress has to manhandle it, has to go through this mixed committee of the House and Senate Indian Affairs Committee, and then they make a recommendation. It goes to the Senate, and then the Senate has to authorize the treaty, and then the president has to sign it. Well, hey, it doesn't happen overnight, but the Indians thought it would. So if you have this treaty in July, by the next year, do you need to plant a crop? You're going to get paid. Do you need to go hunting? Well, you're going to get paid. And nothing happens. So what will happen then is that in 1838, we have a lot of Indian violence on the St. Croix. Now, who is there? Well, not a lot of people, except the loggers that flooded in right as soon as the ink was dry. And then there are these missionaries. And the missionaries had moved by that time from Yellow Lake down to Pokegama Lake, which is on the Snake River near where today's Pine City is. And I get my information on this in part from the missionary papers, but I get it partly from a man named Folsom who wrote 50 Years in the Northwest, and I believe he must have interviewed Mrs. Ayer, especially one of the missionaries. And he tells us that there were tremendous irritations to start with. Things would go missing, somebody has stolen things. Well, then animals begin to be preyed upon. The ox is killed. That's the biggest Indian protest in Ojibwa country. Kill an ox. Show a white guy who's boss. And then beyond that, there can be other things. We can threaten violence. We can burn things. There's a lot that you can do to scare a white guy. One of the things that happened is that one of the logging wanigans was pushed over the falls on the St. Croix, 1838. Yep. And they waited and waited and waited. And finally, in the fall, the news that the treaty is ratified has come through and the annuity payment is going to come, and the water is too low. It comes on a steamboat. And it gets as far as Lake St. Croix, and it can't come up any farther. But that's the old Dakota area down there. And the Ojibwa have to go down, of all insults, you have to, instead of St. Croix Falls, you have to come down to this other place. So then the next year, the Indian Agency decides that the payment is going to be moved to La Pointe, Madeline Island. And that'll be safe, and they can get the payment there. Now, why does the government make the plan to sign a treaty and then not have a transportation plan in mind and not know how do we deliver these goods? But the ineptness of this whole thing is just incredible. So then the next year, they're supposed to be at La Pointe, but for reasons that I do not understand, there is a set of Ojibwa who come down to Fort Snelling, and apparently they thought they were going to be paid there. And William Aiken is with them. So the trader is with them. They're all down. It's 1839. They're down at the fort. There's adventures at the fort. And then at the end of it, there is the unfortunate Ojibwa Dakota. Somebody got out of line, and all of a sudden, all the peacefulness is gone. And in the whole thing, these people who innocently came down there now had a target on their foreheads and no annuity payment for it. And part of them head back up the Rum River with Dakota following behind and hammer them on the rum. And part of them are in that Battle Hollow story that I'm sure you're going to look into for Stillwater. And William Aiken is in the Stillwater story. He is literally there in the water with the Dakota attacking. And the Pokegama Mission hears about this. And they say at that time that they believe that almost the entire Mille Lacs band has been wiped out. That's what the word is when the runners come through after that attack. So 1839 is a horrible year for the Ojibwa because the annuity payment got moved to a remote place, which, by the way, does not have Indians in the vicinity who are recipients of that annuity. But these people have to go to this neutral place way, way far away. At least it's not Sault Ste. Marie, but it ain't close. So that's the story. And that story continues, that you have to go to Madeline Island all the way through the 1840s. Now again, think about the seasonal round. These are people who want to go to their usual maple sugaring places, their usual fishing places. They've already divided up the landscape. These families go here, these families go here. They know how the world is supposed to work. And the government has now put this hiccup in the whole thing that is just evil. But I've also found one of the saddest ironies for the Ojibwa that ever I could find when I'm doing my digging, and that's that a man named Dr. Edwin James wrote to the Indian Agency saying, I would like to be that agent. Edwin James is the man who was the ghostwriter of the Tanner autobiography called The Falcon. Edwin James had studied Ojibwa. He had been at Sault Ste. Marie. He was an amazing man. And if he had been agent, history would have been different. In my opinion, there wasn't that much farming as a motive in any of the early settlement in Minnesota. And in fact, I have a map that I have found that shows the surveyed parts of Minnesota territory after Wisconsin is lopped off. It's a joke how little amount of area was available. And of that, you know what it is. It's the Chisago area. It's along the river. There isn't that much that is surveyed for a long time. And whites are not supposed to take land until it's surveyed. However, the term in your time is squatters. The term at this time is preemptor. And Congress always gives way to a sob story by a preemptor. And so Congress passes these rules saying, okay, we haven't got a surveyor into this niche yet, but we will make it available for preemption, which means then that whites can go in and start on a place, and as long as they supposedly improve it, once the surveyor comes through, they have first dibs for that spot. So what happens in all of the preempting, the treaty was signed, but you still can't own this. There's no land office. There's none of that. But you show up. So I'm sure you've got people who are logging history people that tell you where all those shacks were put along the St. Croix, where so-and-so, where's Jesse Taylor's place? Where is Mr. Folsom's place? All of those are preempted spots that go all the way down. And always they're choosing first those plum places, the best ferry site, the best crossing over, the best bridge site, the best place where water will fall strong enough to run a wheel. The best place to be able to set up a transshipment spot. Where will the warehouses go? Where will the steamboats stop? All of that in those prime spots are often where an Indian village was. There's a reason why the Indians were there in many of those cases. And so you begin to get those collisions. And as the loggers first came in, the Indians knew they hadn't been paid, and they were vicious on the St. Croix. That was their sport. These guys were fish in a barrel, and they're going down to Fort Snelling saying, help us. They're coming up to the mission. Can anybody speak Ojibwa? Tell us what we can do. And so there was a lot of tense moments in that time. But as you go forward, what will happen is that those young, vigorous men need wives. And they have no white women here to marry. So there will be that first generation of settlers will often be a white man marrying into the tribe. And with that, you get one set of alliances. You had the same kinds of alliances in the fur trade. But as soon as you get Victorian white women in any community, the mixed blood is looked down on. It's just the name of the game. So these phrases, squaw man, and that kind of thing will happen. But you begin to get a few plucky women. You can go down all the way to Prescott and Hastings and all those communities that are north of that on the St. Croix, and you will find these legendary early women that come in. But they're mostly living right along the river. These are not people who are going up over the hillsides and back into the interior. No. For a long time, that's going to be very river-oriented in all the settlements. Mr. Folsom is interesting. Mr. Folsom was down at Prairie du Chien. And Mr. Folsom had a number of businesses there, and then he was at Stillwater. But he has his eye on this site up at Taylor's Falls, and that's where he ends up plunking. And the joke on him is that when Wisconsin Territory becomes state of Wisconsin and that border is set, it tears apart these very young white communities that are all along the river. There's a reason why you have Duluth and Superior. There's a reason why you have St. Croix Falls and Taylor's Falls. There's a reason why you have Prescott and Hastings. There's a reason why, well, you get the picture. And that is because in normal circumstances, the town would be both sides of the river. But they made that arbitrary boundary. And the politics of founding that new Minnesota territory meant that every potential town site was a population site, and therefore a contributor toward power in the legislature. And so you have to pump these up as best you can. But because they're two sides of the river, they're always by definition going to be diluted, because you can only have so many how many grocery stores can you have in Taylor's Falls / St. Croix Falls? Essentially, there is not that much farming for a long time. Yes, there are farms, but after the 37 treaty, the big thing is the logging. And Maine has just been denuded. And we have these people from Maine and New Brunswick who show up here. And that large Yankee group that's at Stillwater comes in as a result of, there's a second treaty. The Dakota had given up the land in south of the line for the Ojibwa. And they gave up south of Chippewa Falls and toward the Black River and in that area in there, and then all the way over to Fort Snelling. So that triangle of land that is where St. Croix and Mississippi meet, that was ceded by the Dakota.
The 1837 Pine Tree Treaty had an important impact on the thinking of the Ojibwa bands along the southern shore of Lake Superior. Chief Buffalo of the LaPointe Band, whom Governor Dodge referred to as a man of great influence among his tribe and very friendly to the whites, spoke the sentiments of the Indians of the region in a message directed directly to Governor Dodge. I have nothing to say about the treaty, good or bad, because the country was not mine. But when it comes my turn, I shall know how to act. If the Americans want my land, I shall know what to say. I did not like to stand in the road of the Indians at St. Peter's. I listened to our great father's words and laid them in my heart. I have not forgotten them. The Indians acted like children. They tried to cheat each other and got cheated themselves. When it comes my turn to sell my land, I do not think I shall give it up as they did. 5 years after Chief Buffalo spoke these words, the elderly chief faced American Treaty Commissioner Robert Stewart, who was determined to acquire all remaining Ojibwa lands in Wisconsin. As Stewart discovered, Buffalo's fire was far from out. Recognized as the principal chief of the Lake Superior Chippewa for nearly a half-century until his death in 1855, Chief Buffalo led his nation into numerous treaty relationships with the United States government. He signed treaties in 1825, 1826, 1837, 1842, 47, and 1854. He was instrumental and successful in resisting the efforts of the United States to remove the Chippewa to western areas, and with a vision toward the future, was able to secure permanent Indian reservations for his people near Lake Superior.